My name is Natalie, and last week I was standing in my kitchen in Portland, staring at a stack of real estate magazines that had mysteriously appeared on my counter. The colorful pages showcased beautiful condos and starter homes, all circled in red ink with notes like perfect for a fresh start and ideal for someone starting over. I couldn't help but laugh at the irony. 3 months ago, I thought those magazines would have destroyed me. Today, they just reminded me of how much my life had transformed in ways I never could have imagined. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. You see, there's something uniquely devastating about having your world shattered in a place that's supposed to celebrate love. When someone drops a bombshell that changes everything, you'd expect it to happen during a heated argument or a moment of raw honesty at home. You wouldn't expect it to happen at the Rooftop Terrace, Portland's most romantic restaurant, while you're wearing your favorite emerald dress and celebrating 8 years of what you thought was a happy marriage. But life has a twisted sense of timing, and sometimes the most beautiful settings become the backdrop for the ugliest revelations. 3 months ago, if someone had told me that my husband Marcus announcing he wanted a divorce would become the catalyst for the best chapter of my life, I would have thought they were delusional. Now, as I flip through those real estate magazines with a cup of coffee in hand and genuine excitement about the future, I realize that sometimes the worst thing that can happen to you becomes the doorway to everything you never knew you wanted. The story I'm about to share begins 3 months ago, but really, it started long before that October evening when the autumn rain painted streaks down the restaurant's floor-to-ceiling windows. It started in the quiet moments when I began to notice that the man I'd married was slowly becoming a stranger. It started when I realized that I'd been working so hard to keep our marriage afloat that I'd forgotten to ask myself if I even wanted to be on that particular ship anymore. I've always been someone who throws herself completely into everything she does. At Sterling Marketing Agency, my colleagues know me as the person who stays late to perfect campaigns, who remembers everyone's coffee orders, and who somehow manages to turn even the most challenging clients into success stories. That same energy, that same dedication to making things work perfectly, is exactly what I poured into my marriage with Marcus Thompson for 8 years. Marcus and I met during my senior year at Portland State University. He was already building his construction business with his partner Tyler Walsh, and I was finishing my marketing degree while working part-time at a local advertising firm. There was something magnetic about his confidence, the way he could walk into a room and immediately command attention without saying a word. He had these grand plans for expanding Thompson and Walsh Construction into commercial real estate development, and when he talked about the future, his eyes would light up with this infectious enthusiasm that made you want to be part of whatever he was building. Our early years together felt like we were constructing something beautiful and solid, just like the buildings his company created around Portland. We bought our house in the Hillsdale neighborhood, a charming craftsman-style home with a front porch that Marcus promised he'd restore to its original glory. We hosted dinner parties where I'd coordinate every detail while he'd entertain guests with stories from construction sites and plans for the next big project. I genuinely believed we were building a life together that would stand the test of time. But somewhere along the way, probably around year 5 or 6, I started to notice hairline cracks in our foundation. Marcus would come home later and later, claiming that the business demanded more of his time as they took on larger projects. Our conversations began to revolve entirely around logistics: who would pick up groceries when the mortgage payment was due, whether we needed to call someone about the weird noise the dishwasher was making. The dreams we used to share about traveling together, maybe starting a family, or even just planning weekend getaways began to fade into practical discussions about property taxes and insurance premiums. I told myself this was normal. This was what marriage looked like after the honeymoon phase ended. I threw myself even deeper into making our relationship work, planning surprise date nights that Marcus would show up to distracted, organizing weekend trips that he'd spend on his phone dealing with work emergencies. I started to feel like I was a one-person construction crew trying to repair a building while the other person kept removing the supports I'd just installed. The loneliness crept in so gradually that I almost didn't notice it at first. I'd find myself having entire conversations with our neighbor's cat while watering the plants on our front porch. I'd catch myself staying later at the office not because I had urgent projects, but because going home to a house where Marcus was physically present but emotionally absent felt more isolating than being alone. My best friend Claire, who owns Brew and Books Cafe in the Pearl District, started commenting that I looked tired all the time, but I brushed off her concerns with the same efficiency I used to brush off my own growing doubts. The irony is that while I was working overtime to save my marriage, my professional life was flourishing in ways I'd never expected. Sterling Marketing Agency had assigned me to lead a campaign for a major Portland tourism initiative, and my innovative approach had caught the attention of several high-profile clients. I was traveling to conferences, presenting strategies to city council members, and receiving recognition from industry publications. For the first time in years, I felt genuinely excited about something, genuinely proud of what I was accomplishing. But every success at work seemed to highlight the growing emptiness at home. Marcus would nod politely when I shared news about a successful campaign launch or a new client contract, but I could see his attention drifting toward his phone or the television within minutes. Meanwhile, any mention of his business struggles or challenging projects would dominate our entire evening, with me listening attentively and offering support while feeling like my own achievements were background noise in my own life. Looking back now, I realize that Marcus had probably been planning his exit strategy for months, maybe even longer. There were signs I chose to interpret as temporary stress, rather than fundamental changes in how he saw our future together. He stopped making plans that extended more than a few weeks ahead. When I'd mention things like our upcoming anniversary or holiday plans, he'd respond with vague statements like "we'll see how things go" or "let's just take it one day at a time." He started working out more frequently, updating his wardrobe, and paying attention to his appearance in ways that felt less like self-care and more like preparation for something. The most telling sign, though, was how he began to treat our shared spaces. Our house, which had once felt like a collaborative project, started to feel like a place where he was temporarily staying, rather than permanently living. He stopped contributing to household discussions about improvements or repairs. When our kitchen faucet started leaking, instead of offering to fix it or discussing replacement options like he used to, he'd just work around it as if it were a minor inconvenience in a hotel room, rather than a problem in his own home. I think part of me knew what was coming, but I'd become so skilled at managing everyone else's comfort and happiness that I'd forgotten how to listen to my own instincts. When Marcus suggested we celebrate our anniversary at the Rooftop Terrace, I was actually thrilled. It felt like maybe he was finally ready to invest in us again, to remember why we'd chosen each other in the first place. I spent the entire day of our anniversary feeling hopeful in a way I hadn't experienced in months. I chose my emerald dress carefully, the one Marcus had complimented me on during our third anniversary dinner. I made a reservation at the salon for my hair and makeup, something I rarely did for myself anymore. I even bought a small gift, a vintage watch I'd found at an antique shop downtown that reminded me of one his grandfather used to wear. I was prepared to celebrate 8 years together and hopefully discuss plans for many more. The Rooftop Terrace lived up to its reputation that evening. The October rain created a romantic atmosphere as it streaked down the windows, and the city lights below twinkled like stars. Our table was perfectly positioned near the window, and the staff had already prepared the champagne Marcus had requested when making the reservation. Everything felt deliberately designed for romance, for celebration, for marking a significant milestone in a relationship worth preserving. Marcus looked handsome in his navy suit, and for the first few minutes, sitting across from him with candles flickering between us and soft jazz playing in the background, I felt a flutter of the connection that had drawn us together years ago. We ordered our favorite dishes, the pan-seared salmon for me, the ribeye for him, and I found myself relaxing for the first time in weeks. Maybe this was exactly what we needed. Maybe this elegant evening would remind us both of what we were fighting to preserve. The conversation started innocuously enough. We talked about work, about the unusually rainy fall Portland was experiencing, about the restaurant's impressive wine selection. Marcus seemed more present than he'd been in months, asking thoughtful questions about my current campaigns and sharing amusing stories from recent construction sites. I began to feel foolish for all the worry and anxiety I'd been carrying. Clearly, we just needed to make more effort to prioritize our relationship, to create spaces for connection like this beautiful dinner. It was when our entrees arrived that the mood began to shift in a way I couldn't quite identify at first. Marcus became quieter, more thoughtful, and I noticed him glancing around the restaurant as if he were checking to see who might be watching us. I assumed he was just savoring the moment, appreciating the romantic setting he'd chosen for our celebration. I raised my champagne glass to toast our anniversary, expecting him to mirror my gesture with a warm smile and maybe some sweet words about our journey together. Instead, Marcus looked directly at me with an expression I'd never seen before, not angry, not sad, but completely resolved in a way that made my stomach drop even before he spoke. Natalie, he said, his voice steady and surprisingly calm, I've been thinking about this for a long time, and I think our marriage has run its course. I want a divorce. The words hung in the air between us like smoke from a fire I hadn't seen coming. The ambient noise of the restaurant, the gentle clinking of glasses, the low hum of conversation from other tables, the soft jazz that had felt so romantic moments before, suddenly felt impossibly loud and completely surreal. I stared at Marcus, waiting for him to smile and say it was some kind of inappropriate joke, or to clarify that he'd misspoken, or to show any sign that he understood the magnitude of what he'd just said. But he didn't. He simply looked at me with that same resolved expression, as if he'd just announced he was changing jobs or we were moving to a different neighborhood. The casual delivery of such devastating news felt almost more shocking than the news itself. I'm sorry, he continued, cutting a piece of his steak as if this were a normal conversation over a normal dinner. I know this isn't ideal timing, but I thought you deserved to know where I stand. I've already spoken to a lawyer, and I think we can handle this amicably. We're both reasonable people. I sat there, my champagne glass still raised halfway to my lips, trying to process not just what he was saying but how he was saying it. This wasn't a moment of passion or anger. This wasn't the result of a fight or even a particularly difficult period in our marriage.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
This was a calculated decision delivered with the same tone he'd used to discuss quarterly business reports. The salmon on my plate, which had looked so appealing minutes before, now seemed completely inedible. The romantic ambiance of the rooftop terrace felt like an elaborate cruel joke. The emerald dress I'd chosen so carefully now felt like a costume for a role I was no longer playing. Most jarring of all was the realization that Marcus had planned this moment, had chosen this setting, had suggested this celebration specifically as the backdrop for ending our marriage. For several long moments, I couldn't speak. I could only stare at this man I'd shared a bed with for 8 years, who knew how I liked my coffee in the morning, and which side of the couch I preferred for movie nights, who had just demolished our entire shared life with the same emotional investment most people bring to ordering takeout. When I finally found my voice, the first thing that came out was, "You planned this, didn't you? You chose tonight, this place, specifically to tell me you want a divorce." Marcus had the decency to look slightly uncomfortable for the first time since he'd started speaking. I thought it would be better to do it somewhere public, somewhere civil. I didn't want it to become a big emotional scene at home. The calculation behind that statement hit me like a physical blow. He hadn't chosen the rooftop terrace to celebrate our anniversary. He'd chosen it to contain my reaction to the news that he was ending our marriage. He'd deliberately trapped me in a setting where I'd be forced to remain composed, where I couldn't fully express whatever emotions his announcement might trigger, where the social pressure of being in public would prevent me from responding authentically to having my life turned upside down. 8 years, I said quietly, more to myself than to him. 8 years, and you think the appropriate way to end it is over anniversary dinner at the most romantic restaurant in Portland. Natalie, please don't make this harder than it needs to be. Marcus replied, and I could hear a slight edge of impatience in his voice, as if I were being unreasonably dramatic about the situation. We both know we haven't been happy for a while. We're just going through the motions. Wouldn't it be better to end things before we start resenting each other? The audacity of him speaking for my happiness, of assuming he knew how I felt about our marriage, of framing this devastating blindside as some kind of mutual decision we'd been moving toward together, sparked the first real flash of anger I'd felt since he'd started talking. But alongside the anger was something else, something I didn't expect and couldn't quite identify in that moment. Relief maybe, or curiosity about what would happen next. "So what's the plan?" I asked, surprising myself with how steady my voice sounded. "You've obviously thought this through. You've talked to a lawyer, you've chosen the perfect public setting to minimize any inconvenient emotional responses from your wife. What exactly happens next in this well-orchestrated exit strategy of yours?" Marcus looked slightly taken aback by my tone, as if he'd expected tears or pleading, rather than questions about logistics. "Well, I was thinking we could start with mediation. Split everything fairly. You can keep the house if you want it, though you might want to consider something smaller and more manageable. I'll cover the transition costs." The paternalistic tone of his suggestions, as if he were helping me navigate a difficult situation rather than creating it, crystallized something inside me that had been building for months without my full awareness. This wasn't just about Marcus wanting to end our marriage. This was about the fundamental way he saw me, the way he'd been seeing me probably for years. I wasn't a partner whose feelings and preferences mattered. I was a problem to be managed, a situation to be handled efficiently and with minimal disruption to his own plans. As I sat there in my carefully chosen emerald dress, surrounded by the romantic ambiance he'd deliberately selected as the backdrop for dismantling our shared life, I realized that Marcus had made a crucial miscalculation. He'd assumed that after 8 years of prioritizing his comfort, managing his needs, and smoothing over every rough edge in our relationship, I would continue to do so even as he ended that relationship. He'd assumed I would make his divorce as easy and convenient for him as I'd been making everything else. But something had shifted in me during those months of growing professional confidence and personal loneliness. Something had changed in the space between the woman who'd walked into the rooftop terrace, expecting to celebrate her anniversary, and the woman who was now sitting across from a man who'd just casually demolished their marriage, while cutting his steak. I took a sip of my champagne, set down the glass with deliberate care, and looked directly at Marcus with what I hoped was the same composed expression he'd been wearing since he'd started this conversation. "You know what, Marcus," I said, my voice calm and clear. "You're absolutely right. We should definitely get divorced." For the first time since he'd started talking, Marcus looked genuinely surprised. The confusion that flickered across Marcus's face was almost comical. He'd clearly scripted this entire conversation in his mind, probably rehearsed it multiple times, and my agreement wasn't part of his anticipated dialogue. He set down his fork and stared at me as if I'd suddenly started speaking a foreign language. "I'm sorry, what did you just say?" he asked, his voice carrying a note of uncertainty that I hadn't heard from him in years. "I said you're right. We should get divorced," I repeated, reaching for my purse and pulling out my phone. "In fact, I'm so convinced you're right that I think we should start the process immediately. Do you happen to have that lawyer's contact information with you? I'd love to call them right now and get this moving." Marcus's carefully composed demeanor began to crack around the edges. "Natalie, slow down. I think you're misunderstanding the situation. This doesn't have to be rushed or dramatic. We can take our time to figure out the details." "Oh, but I think you're the one misunderstanding," I said, scrolling through my phone with exaggerated enthusiasm. "You've just given me the most liberating news I've heard in months. Why would I want to delay something so wonderful? I'm actually wondering why we didn't think of this sooner." The restaurant around us continued its gentle buzz of conversation and clinking glasses, completely oblivious to the fact that my marriage was dissolving at table 12. A waiter approached to refill our water glasses, and I smiled at him so brightly that he actually paused, as if trying to determine whether we were celebrating something special. "We're getting divorced," I announced to him cheerfully. "Isn't that exciting?" The poor waiter's eyes widened, and he glanced between Marcus and me, as if trying to determine whether this was some kind of elaborate joke, or if he should call security. Marcus's face flushed red, and for the first time since this conversation began, he looked genuinely uncomfortable. "Natalie, please," he hissed under his breath. "People are starting to stare." "Are they?" I asked, looking around the restaurant with genuine curiosity. "How interesting. I wonder if it's because they're witnessing something so joyful." "You know, Marcus, I think you were absolutely brilliant to choose such a romantic setting for this announcement. The ambiance really enhances the experience." I could see Marcus struggling to regain control of the situation. This clearly wasn't going according to his plan, and the man who'd confidently dismantled our 8-year marriage minutes earlier was now fidgeting with his napkin like a nervous teenager. "Look, I think we should probably head home and discuss this more privately," he said, already reaching for his wallet. "Oh no, I don't think so," I replied, taking another sip of champagne. "I'm having far too much fun to leave now. Besides, you chose this place specifically for this conversation, remember? Because it would keep things civil and prevent any big emotional scenes." "Well, I'm being perfectly civil. I'm agreeing with everything you've said. I'm even offering to help expedite the process you've already started. This is going exactly as you planned." The truth was, I had no idea where this newfound confidence was coming from. 3 hours earlier, if someone had told me my husband would ask for a divorce over anniversary dinner, I would have predicted tears, pleading, maybe even fainting. Instead, I felt oddly energized, as if Marcus had accidentally unlocked a door I hadn't even known existed. "You're acting strange," Marcus said, his voice carrying a note of accusation, as if my failure to crumble at his announcement was somehow inappropriate. "Strange?" I laughed, and the sound surprised even me with its genuine mirth. "Marcus, my husband just told me he wants to end our marriage during our anniversary dinner at the most expensive restaurant in Portland. If anyone's acting strange here, I don't think it's me." I signaled the waiter, who approached our table with obvious trepidation. "Could I please have another glass of champagne? The good stuff?" I'm celebrating. Celebrating what, ma'am? The waiter asked, clearly confused by the tension he could feel at our table. My impending freedom, I said with a bright smile. My husband has just given me the most wonderful gift. He's offered to divorce me, and I've accepted. I think that deserves the best champagne you have. Marcus looked like he wanted to crawl under the table. The waiter glanced at him uncertainly, clearly unsure how to respond to this unprecedented situation. Just bring the check, Marcus muttered. Oh no, I said firmly. We haven't finished our meals yet, and I specifically ordered the chocolate souffle for dessert. I've been looking forward to it all week. Surely you're not going to deny me dessert on such a momentous occasion. The bizarre nature of the entire situation was beginning to dawn on me, and instead of feeling devastated, I felt almost giddy. Here I was, sitting in the most romantic restaurant in Portland, discussing the dissolution of my marriage, while insisting on dessert. It was so absurd that I couldn't help but find it amusing. Natalie, I think you're in shock, Marcus said, attempting to sound concerned. This is a big change, and you're not processing it normally. You're right, I'm not processing it normally. I agreed. Normally when someone announces they want to divorce me, I might be upset. But you know what? I've spent the last 2 years feeling like I'm married to a roommate who occasionally acknowledges my existence. I've spent months wondering if this is what the rest of my life is going to look like. And now you've just solved that problem for me. I should be thanking you. I reached across the table and patted his hand with mock sincerity. Thank you, Marcus. Really, thank you for having the courage to end something that clearly wasn't working for either of us. His hand jerked away from mine, as if I'd burned him. You're being ridiculous. Am I? Let me ask you something. When was the last time we had a conversation that lasted longer than 10 minutes, and wasn't about household logistics or your work problems? When was the last time you asked me how I felt about anything that mattered? When was the last time you showed any interest in my thoughts, my dreams, my goals beyond how they might affect your comfort and convenience? Marcus opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. I could see him mentally searching for examples that would contradict my point, and his growing frustration when he couldn't find any. That's not fair, he said finally. I've been under a lot of pressure with the business. You know how demanding construction can be. Oh, I know exactly how demanding your business is, I said. I know because for 8 years, I've structured my entire life around accommodating those demands. I've canceled plans when you needed me to entertain clients. I've spent weekends alone while you worked on emergency projects. I've listened to you complain about difficult contractors and delayed permits for hours, while you've shown zero interest in my own professional challenges and successes. The waiter returned with my champagne, setting it down with the careful precision of someone trying not to get involved in whatever was happening at our table. I raised the glass in a toast. To Marcus Thompson, I announced loudly enough for nearby tables to hear. For having the wisdom to recognize that our marriage wasn't serving either of us, and the honesty to do something about it. Several diners at surrounding tables had definitely begun to pay attention to our conversation, and Marcus was visibly squirming in his seat. The man who'd been so confident about controlling the narrative of our divorce was rapidly losing his grip on the situation. Can you please keep your voice down? He pleaded. Why, are you embarrassed? This should be a happy moment, Marcus. You're getting exactly what you want. In fact, let me make this even easier for you. I pulled out my phone again and started typing. I'm texting my friend Claire right now.
She knows an excellent divorce attorney. David Kim, I think his name is, has an office downtown, great reviews. I'll set up an appointment for first thing Monday morning. Marcus's face had gone from red to pale. You don't need to do that tonight. We can handle this reasonably, over time. But why wait? You've clearly been planning this for months. You've already consulted a lawyer. You've thought through the logistics. You've even figured out the perfect public setting to announce your decision. I'm just trying to match your level of preparation and enthusiasm. I took another sip of champagne and smiled at him. You know what the best part of this is? I don't have to pretend anymore. I don't have to pretend that I'm happy with a marriage where I do all the emotional labor while you check out. I don't have to pretend that it's normal for a husband to show more interest in his phone than in his wife. I don't have to pretend that this is what love looks like. That's not fair, Marcus protested. I work hard to provide for us. I've built a successful business. I've given you a comfortable life. You've built a successful business for yourself, I corrected. And yes, I've had a comfortable life. A comfortable, lonely, emotionally empty life, where I felt more like your personal assistant than your partner. But you know what? That's about to change. The waiter approached again, this time carrying our dessert menus. Are you folks interested in dessert this evening? Oh yes, I said enthusiastically. I'll definitely have the chocolate souffle. And you know what? Let's make it two. We're celebrating. Marcus waved the waiter away. We don't need dessert. Just the check. Speak for yourself, I said. I absolutely need dessert. In fact, I think I need to start doing a lot of things just for myself. Starting tonight. I turned to the waiter with a bright smile. 2 chocolate soufflés, please. And maybe some of those petite fours I saw on the dessert cart. Tonight feels like a night for indulgence. As the waiter walked away, probably grateful to escape our table, Marcus leaned forward with obvious frustration. Natalie, you're making a scene. This isn't like you. You're right, it isn't like me. The me you know would be crying right now. She'd be begging you to reconsider, promising to change, asking what she did wrong. She'd be making your divorce as easy and convenient as possible, just like she made everything else in your life easy and convenient. I took another sip of champagne. But you know what? I don't think I want to be that person anymore. So what? You're just going to completely change your personality overnight. Or maybe this is who I've always been underneath, and I just spent 8 years hiding it to keep you comfortable. Did you ever consider that possibility? Marcus stared at me as if I were a stranger, which I was beginning to realize I might have been for most of our marriage. The woman he'd married was someone who prioritized his needs above her own, who smoothed over conflicts rather than addressing them, who made herself smaller so he could feel bigger. But that woman was exhausted, and apparently she'd been waiting for permission to retire. I don't understand what's happening here, Marcus said. And for the first time since this conversation began, he sounded genuinely confused rather than confidently in control. What's happening is that you've just given me the best gift you could have possibly given me, I said. You've released me from a marriage that was slowly suffocating me. You've freed me from the obligation to keep pretending that I'm happy with scraps of attention and affection. You've given me permission to stop working so hard to fix something that was fundamentally broken. The chocolate soufflés arrived, and I immediately dug into mine with obvious pleasure. It was absolutely delicious, rich and decadent, and exactly what I needed in that moment. Marcus didn't touch his. You're really going to sit there and eat dessert while we discuss ending our marriage? He asked incredulously. Why not? You sat there and ate your steak while announcing you wanted to end our marriage. At least I'm being honest about enjoying myself. I could see Marcus struggling to understand how the evening had spiraled so far from his carefully planned script. He'd expected tears, negotiation, maybe even anger. He'd prepared for emotional manipulation, for pleas to reconsider, for the kind of dramatic scene that would make him feel guilty but also justified in his decision. What he clearly hadn't prepared for was genuine enthusiasm for his proposal. So what happens now? He asked, and I could hear uncertainty creeping into his voice for the first time. Now we get divorced, I said, cheerfully. Just like you wanted. I'll call David Kim first thing Monday morning. We'll divide our assets fairly, just like you suggested. You mentioned I could keep the house, which is generous, though I'm actually thinking I might want to sell it, and find something that feels more like mine and less like ours. You love that house, Marcus said, sounding almost offended. I loved the idea of that house. I loved what it represented when we bought it together. But honestly, it's always felt more like your house that I happen to live in. Kind of like our marriage, actually. I took another bite of souffle and smiled at him. You know what I'm really looking forward to? Decorating a space that's entirely mine. No compromising on furniture that matches your aesthetic but feels cold to me. No negotiating about wall colors or artwork. Just me, creating a space that makes me happy. We picked out that furniture together, Marcus protested. No, Marcus, you expressed strong opinions about what you liked, and I agreed because avoiding conflict seemed more important than having my preferences acknowledged. There's a difference. The truth of that statement hit me as I said it. How many decisions in our marriage had followed that same pattern? How many times had I convinced myself that I was being collaborative when I was actually just being accommodating? I think you're romanticizing what life will be like on your own, Marcus said, and there was an edge to his voice now that suggested he was beginning to feel less confident about the situation. Maybe I am, I agreed. But you know what? Even if single life turns out to be challenging, at least I'll be facing those challenges as myself instead of as the diminished version of myself I became in this marriage. I finished my souffle and sat back in my chair, feeling more satisfied than I had in months, and not just because of the dessert. This has been wonderful, Marcus. Really, I can't remember the last time I felt this clear about anything. You've given me such a gift tonight. Marcus looked around the restaurant nervously, clearly aware that other diners were still paying attention to our conversation. Can we please continue this at home? Why are you uncomfortable having this conversation in public? But this is what you wanted, remember? A civil public setting where emotions wouldn't get too messy. I smiled at him sweetly. Mission accomplished. I signaled for the waiter and asked for the check. When it arrived, I immediately reached for my credit card. I've got this, Marcus said, reaching for his wallet. Oh no, I insist, I said firmly. This meal has been such a revelation for me. The least I can do is pay for the privilege. As I signed the receipt, I felt Marcus watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Confusion, certainly. Maybe a little fear. Definitely not the relief and gratitude he'd probably expected to feel after successfully ending his marriage. You know, I said, as I stood up and gathered my purse, I think I'm going to take a walk around downtown before heading home. Clear my head, think about the future, don't wait up for me. Natalie, it's raining, Marcus pointed out. I know I love walking in the rain. I haven't done it in years, because you always said it was impractical. I smiled at him one more time. I guess I can be as impractical as I want now. As I walked away from our table, leaving Marcus sitting there with his untouched souffle and his thoroughly derailed divorce announcement, I heard him call my name. But I didn't turn around. For the first time in 8 years, I was walking towards something that belonged entirely to me, and I wasn't going to look back. The rain felt like a baptism as I walked through downtown Portland that night. My emerald dress was completely soaked within minutes. My carefully styled hair hung in wet strands around my face, and my heels clicked against the wet pavement with a rhythm that somehow matched the newfound clarity pulsing through my veins. I wandered through the Pearl District without any destination in mind, feeling more alive than I had in years. I ended up at Claire's apartment around 11:30, dripping wet and probably looking like I'd escaped from some kind of disaster. When she opened the door and saw me standing there, her expression immediately shifted from surprise to concern. Natalie, what happened? You look like you've been swimming in your evening wear. Can I come in? I have news. Claire ushered me inside, immediately wrapping me in one of her oversized bathrobes and putting the kettle on for tea. Her apartment was everything mine wasn't. Eclectic, colorful, filled with books and plants and artwork that reflected her personality rather than some magazine's idea of what a home should look like. I'd always loved visiting Claire's space, though I'd never allowed myself to admit how much I envied the way it felt so authentically hers. Okay, start talking, she said, settling onto her couch with 2 steaming mugs. Did something happen at dinner? Where's Marcus? Marcus asked me for a divorce tonight, I said, and was surprised to hear myself laughing as I said it. At the Rooftop Terrace, over our anniversary dinner. Can you believe the timing? Claire nearly dropped her mug. He what? Are you serious? At your anniversary dinner. Completely serious. He had it all planned out. Chose a public place, so I wouldn't make a scene. Already talked to a lawyer. Had the whole thing mapped out like a business transaction. I curled up in the corner of her sofa, feeling oddly comfortable despite the fact that my life had just imploded. And you know what the strangest part is? I said yes. You said yes to what? To the divorce. I told him he was absolutely right, and that we should start the process immediately. I think I might have traumatized him. Claire stared at me as if I'd grown a second head. Natalie, are you okay? Are you in shock? Should I be worried about you? I'm perfect, Claire. I'm better than I've been in years. Marcus just handed me my freedom on a silver platter, and I finally realized I wanted it more than I wanted to keep fighting for a marriage that was slowly killing my spirit. I told her everything about the evening, Marcus's calculated announcement, my unexpected response, his growing confusion as I enthusiastically agreed to his divorce proposal. Claire listened with her mouth hanging open, occasionally interjecting with exclamations of disbelief. I can't believe you ordered dessert, she said, when I finished. I can't believe you made him sit there while you ate chocolate souffle and planned your divorce. It was really good souffle, I said with a grin. I think I'm going to start ordering dessert more often. I've been depriving myself of so many things, to maintain some impossible standard of what a good wife should be. Claire leaned back against her cushions, studying my face carefully. You seem almost happy about this. Are you sure you're processing this correctly? I've never been more sure of anything in my life. You know what I realized tonight? I've been mourning this marriage for 2 years. I've been grieving the connection Marcus and I used to have, trying to resurrect something that died a long time ago. Tonight he just made it official. I spent the night at Claire's, and for the first time in months, I slept deeply and dreamlessly. When I woke up the next morning, my first thought wasn't about what Marcus might need from me, or what household tasks required my attention. Instead, I found myself thinking about David Kim, the divorce attorney Claire had recommended, and wondering how quickly I could get an appointment. Claire made us coffee and sat across from me at her small kitchen table, still looking concerned. So what's the plan? Are you really going to call that lawyer today? First thing Monday morning, I confirmed. Marcus thinks we can take our time and handle this gradually, but I don't see any point in dragging this out. He's already made up his mind, and now that I've had a night to think about it, so have I. What about the house? Your job, all the practical stuff. I'll figure it out. For the first time in years, I get to make decisions based entirely on what I want rather than what works best for both of us. It's terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. When I finally returned home Sunday afternoon, Marcus was waiting for me in the living room, with an expression I'd never seen before, something between worry and irritation, with a healthy dose of confusion mixed in. Where have you been? I was starting to get concerned. I stayed at Claire's. I figured you'd appreciate having some space to process everything. I set my purse down and looked around our house with fresh eyes. It really did feel more like his space than ours, I realized. The furniture we'd chosen together was all practical and neutral, reflecting his preference for clean lines and minimal color. The few personal touches that reflected my taste had been relegated to corners or less prominent spaces. Natalie, I think we need to talk about last night. I think you might have misunderstood what I was saying. I turned to look at him, genuinely curious about where this was going. How so? I was thinking that maybe we should try separation first. Take some time apart to figure out what we really want. Divorce seems so final. The irony of this statement was almost too much to handle. 24 hours earlier, Marcus had confidently announced that our marriage had run its course, and that he'd already consulted a lawyer. Now apparently, divorce seemed too final. Marcus, yesterday you told me you'd been thinking about this for a long time. You said our marriage had run its course. You said you'd already spoken to a lawyer, and had everything mapped out. What exactly has changed since then? He ran his hands through his hair, in a gesture I recognized as his go-to move, when he was trying to buy time. I just think maybe I was too hasty. Maybe I was having a bad day, feeling overwhelmed with work stress. I didn't expect you to react the way you did. How did you expect me to react? I don't know. I thought you'd be upset. I thought you'd want to talk through our problems, maybe suggest counseling or something. I didn't think you'd just agree. The pieces clicked into place with startling clarity. Marcus hadn't actually wanted a divorce when he'd made his announcement. He'd wanted a reaction. He'd wanted me to fight for our marriage, to prove how much I needed him, to recommit to making him the center of my universe. His divorce threat had been a manipulation tactic, and my enthusiastic agreement had completely backfired on him. So let me understand this correctly, I said slowly. You announced you wanted a divorce, not because you actually wanted a divorce, but because you wanted to see me panic and beg you to stay. Marcus looked genuinely uncomfortable for the first time since I'd walked in the door. That's not exactly how I'd put it. How would you put it? I thought if we were both honest about how unhappy we've been, we could work on fixing things.
I thought maybe a wake-up call would motivate us to try harder. The manipulation behind this strategy was so breathtaking that I had to sit down. For 8 years, I'd been married to a man who thought threatening to leave me was an appropriate way to get me to try harder to please him. Marcus, do you hear yourself right now? You're telling me that you deliberately chose the most hurtful possible setting to announce you wanted to end our marriage, not because you meant it, but because you wanted to manipulate me into begging you to stay.
It wasn't manipulation. It was honesty about our problems. No, honesty about our problems would have been saying I'm unhappy in our marriage and I'd like us to work on fixing it together. What you did was announce you were leaving and then wait to see if I'd grovel enough to change your mind. I could see Marcus struggling to reframe the situation, to find a way to make his behavior seem reasonable rather than cruel and calculating. Look, maybe I didn't handle it perfectly, but the important thing is that we're talking about it now. We can still fix this, Natalie. We just need to put in more effort. Fix what exactly? The fact that you thought threatening divorce was an appropriate way to communicate with your wife. The fact that you're apparently so disconnected from my feelings that you had no idea I might actually want the divorce you were offering. Or the fact that you're now trying to backtrack because my response didn't give you the ego boost you were looking for. Marcus stood up and started pacing, another familiar gesture that usually preceded him trying to take control of a situation that wasn't going his way. You're twisting everything around. You're making me sound like some kind of villain when all I was trying to do was address the problems in our marriage. What problems, Marcus? Specifically, what problems were you trying to address by threatening to divorce me? You know what problems? We barely talk anymore. We're like roommates. There's no passion, no connection. And whose fault is that? It's both of our faults. That's what I'm trying to say. We've both stopped trying. I looked at him standing there in our living room, gesticulating as he tried to convince me that his manipulation had actually been an attempt at honest communication, and I felt something that had been building for months finally crystallize into perfect clarity. Marcus, I never stopped trying. I stopped succeeding, but I never stopped trying. I planned date nights that you attended while checking your phone. I initiated conversations about our future that you deflected with complaints about work. I suggested weekend trips that you canceled for business emergencies that somehow never seemed to affect Tyler as much as they affected you. That's not fair. You know how demanding the construction business is. I know how demanding you've chosen to make it. I also know that Tyler manages to maintain a healthy relationship with his wife while running the same business you do. The difference is that Tyler sees his marriage as a priority worth protecting, while you see yours as an obligation you can ignore when something more interesting comes along. Marcus stopped pacing and stared at me. That's not true. Isn't it? When was the last time you asked me about my work beyond whether it would interfere with your schedule? When was the last time you showed any interest in my thoughts, my goals, my dreams that didn't directly relate to your comfort and convenience? I ask about your work all the time. You ask if I'll be home late. You ask if I have any client events that might conflict with your plans. You ask if my deadlines will make me unavailable to handle things you need. That's not the same as asking about my work because you're interested in my professional life. I could see him mentally scrolling through recent conversations, trying to find examples that would contradict my point. The fact that he had to search so hard was evidence enough. I care about your career, he said finally. You care about my career when it doesn't inconvenience you. When Sterling Marketing offered me that promotion last year, the one that would have required some evening travel, what did you say? Marcus looked uncomfortable. I said we should think carefully about whether it was worth the disruption to our routine. You said I should consider whether advancing my career was worth making your life more difficult. And I turned down the promotion because I prioritized your comfort over my professional growth. Again, I was thinking about both of us. About our marriage. You were thinking about yourself, Marcus. Just like you were thinking about yourself when you decided to threaten divorce as a way to get me to try harder to please you. I walked over to the window and looked out at our front yard, at the garden I'd maintained and the porch Marcus had never gotten around to restoring despite years of promises. You know what I realized last night? I've been married to someone who sees me as a supporting character in his life story rather than the protagonist of my own. And I've been so focused on being the best supporting character possible that I forgot I was supposed to have my own story. That's ridiculous. Of course you have your own story. Do I? What are my goals, Marcus? What are my dreams? What do I want out of life beyond making sure you're happy and comfortable? Marcus opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. The fact that he couldn't immediately answer those questions about the woman he'd been married to for 8 years said everything I needed to know. This isn't just about last night, I continued. Last night was just the moment I finally saw clearly what our relationship had become. You threatening divorce was just the push I needed to stop pretending I was happy with a marriage where I'd made myself invisible. You're not invisible, Natalie. You're being dramatic. Am I? Tell me about the marketing campaign I've been working on for the past 3 months. Tell me about the recognition I received from the Portland Business Journal last month. Tell me about the conference presentation I'm giving next week. Marcus stared at me blankly, and I could see him trying to recall any mention I might have made of these professional achievements. The fact that he was drawing a complete blank despite my excitement about each of these opportunities was the final confirmation I needed. I can't do this anymore, Marcus. I can't keep pretending that a marriage where my husband doesn't know or care about my professional life is worth saving. I can't keep making myself smaller so you can feel bigger. So that's it. You're just going to throw away 8 years because I don't remember every detail of your work projects. I'm not throwing away 8 years. I'm acknowledging that those 8 years taught me what I don't want in a marriage. I want a partner who sees me as an equal, who celebrates my successes instead of viewing them as potential inconveniences. I want someone who knows me well enough to ask meaningful questions about my life because they're genuinely interested in the answers. Marcus sat down heavily on our couch, looking genuinely bewildered by the turn this conversation had taken. I don't understand how we got here. Yesterday morning we were fine. No, Marcus, yesterday morning you were fine. I was miserable and had been for months, but I was hiding it so well that you didn't notice. That's not the same thing as us being fine. I went upstairs and started packing a suitcase, and Marcus followed me, continuing to argue his case as if this were a negotiation he could still win. Where are you going? We need to keep talking about this. I'm going back to Claire's for a few days while I figure out my next steps. I think we've talked enough for now. Natalie, please, don't do this. We can work through this if we both try. I stopped packing and looked at him directly. Marcus, do you love me? Of course I love you. Why? What do you mean? Why? I mean, what do you love about me? Specifically, what qualities do I have that make you want to spend your life with me? Marcus stared at me as if this were a trick question. You're a good wife. You take care of everything. You make my life easier. The fact that he described me as a service provider rather than a person was so perfectly emblematic of our entire relationship that I almost laughed. That's not love, Marcus. That's appreciation for convenience. You don't love me. You love what I do for you. And I don't think you even see the difference. I finished packing and headed toward the stairs. Marcus grabbed my arm gently, not trying to stop me but clearly desperate to make me understand something. Natalie, I need you. Doesn't that count for something? I looked down at his hand on my arm, then back up at his face. Need and love aren't the same thing either, Marcus. You need me because I make your life run smoothly. But you don't know me well enough to love me, and you don't respect me enough to see me as anything more than an extremely efficient personal assistant who happens to share your bed. I gently removed his hand from my arm. I'm calling David Kim first thing tomorrow morning. This marriage is over, and it's been over for a long time. We just finally stopped pretending. As I walked out the door with my suitcase, I heard Marcus call after me one more time. This is all because of last night, isn't it? Because I handled things badly at dinner. I turned back to look at him one final time, standing in the doorway of the house that had never really felt like home to either of us. No, Marcus. Last night is when I finally realized I deserved better than what we had. The marriage ended a long time ago. Last night is just when I stopped trying to perform CPR on something that was already dead. 6 weeks later, I was sitting in David Kim's office downtown signing the final paperwork for the most amicable divorce in Portland's legal history. The irony wasn't lost on me that Marcus's attempt to control the narrative by choosing a public setting for his divorce announcement had actually worked in my favor. His insistence on keeping things civil and reasonable meant he couldn't suddenly become vindictive when I took him at his word. David looked up from the documents with something approaching amazement. I have to say, Mrs. Rodriguez, I've been practicing family law for 15 years, and I've never seen a divorce proceed this smoothly. Your husband's attorney keeps calling to make sure we're not missing some hidden agenda. No hidden agenda, I said, signing my name with a flourish. I'm just giving him exactly what he asked for, exactly the way he wanted it. The transformation in my life during those 6 weeks had been remarkable. Within days of calling David's office, I'd found a charming one-bedroom apartment in the Alberta Arts District, a space that was completely different from the house I'd shared with Marcus. Where our home had been neutral and practical, my new apartment was full of color and character. I'd spent weekends hunting through vintage shops and local artists' studios, finally allowing myself to choose things simply because they made me happy rather than because they matched some predetermined aesthetic. At Sterling Marketing Agency, my newfound confidence had translated into a level of professional boldness I'd never experienced before. Without the constant undercurrent of worry about how my career success might affect Marcus's mood or schedule, I'd thrown myself completely into my work. The tourism campaign I'd been leading had exceeded all expectations, earning recognition from the Portland Tourism Board and generating inquiries from potential clients as far away as Seattle. My boss Rachel Stone had noticed the change immediately. "I don't know what's gotten into you lately, Natalie, but whatever it is, bottle it and sell it. You've been absolutely fearless these past few weeks." "I got divorced," I'd told her with a grin. "Turns out it's incredibly liberating." Rachel had laughed, thinking I was joking, but Claire understood exactly what I meant. She'd watched my transformation with a mixture of pride and amazement, often commenting that it was like watching someone wake up from a years-long sleep. "You're completely different," she'd said over coffee at her cafe the previous weekend. "Not different like you've changed who you are, but different like you've finally remembered who you are." She was right. The woman who'd walked out of the Rooftop Terrace that rainy October night had been someone I'd forgotten existed. The woman who'd spent 8 years managing Marcus's moods and minimizing her own needs had been a performance, a carefully constructed character designed to keep the peace. The real me, it turned out, was someone who enjoyed taking risks, who had strong opinions about art and music and food, who could hold her own in any professional conversation and wasn't afraid to take up space in a room. The divorce proceedings had revealed just how little Marcus actually understood about our shared life. When we'd met with our attorneys to discuss asset division, he'd been genuinely shocked to learn how much my salary had increased over the past few years. He'd somehow missed every promotion, every raise, every professional achievement that had steadily built my career into something substantial and independent. "I had no idea you were making that much," he'd said during one particularly awkward mediation session. "Why didn't you ever mention it?" "I did mention it," I'd replied calmly. "Every time, you just weren't listening." His attorney had looked uncomfortable, clearly recognizing that his client had severely underestimated both my financial independence and my determination to move forward with the divorce. Marcus had clearly expected me to be devastated and dependent, ready to negotiate from a position of weakness. Instead, I'd shown up to every meeting prepared, confident and utterly uninterested in prolonging the process. The house had become the biggest point of contention, not because I wanted it, but because Marcus couldn't understand why I didn't. He'd repeatedly offered to let me keep it, as if it were some great sacrifice on his part, and seemed genuinely baffled when I insisted we sell it and split the proceeds. "But you love that house," he'd argued during one of our final meetings. "You put so much work into making it perfect." "I put work into making it perfect for you," I'd corrected. "It was never really my house, Marcus. It was your house that I happened to live in." The truth was, I'd felt lighter the moment I'd handed over my keys. Walking away from that house had been like shedding a costume I'd worn for too long. Every room held memories of compromise, of making myself smaller, of prioritizing someone else's vision of what our life should look like. My new apartment, with its exposed brick walls and quirky built-in bookshelves, felt more like home after 2 weeks than that house had felt after 8 years. What had surprised me most about the divorce process was how little sadness I felt. I'd expected grief, regret, maybe even second thoughts. Instead, I felt like someone who'd finally put down a heavy backpack after carrying it for miles. The relief was overwhelming and constant. Marcus, on the other hand, seemed to be struggling with emotions he couldn't quite articulate. He'd started showing up at my temporary apartment unannounced, not to fight or argue, but to have conversations that felt increasingly desperate. "I keep thinking about that night at the restaurant," he'd said during one of these impromptu visits. "I feel like I didn't explain myself properly. Like maybe if I'd approached it differently." "Marcus, you explained yourself perfectly," I'd replied. "You wanted out of our marriage, and now you're out. This is what success looks like." "But I don't feel successful. I feel like I made a huge mistake." Maybe you did, but not the mistake you think you made. Your mistake wasn't asking for a divorce. Your mistake was spending 8 years taking me for granted and then being surprised when I turned out to be strong enough to live without you. These conversations always ended the same way, with Marcus looking confused and hurt, as if I were being unnecessarily cruel by holding him accountable for his own choices. He seemed to genuinely believe that because he regretted his decision, I should be willing to pretend it had never happened. The final straw had come 3 weeks into the divorce proceedings, when Marcus had shown up at Sterling Marketing during my lunch break. I'd been in the middle of a strategy session with Rachel and 2 potential clients when the receptionist had called to say my husband was in the lobby asking to speak with me urgently. "Tell him I'll call him later," I'd said, not wanting to interrupt the meeting for what was surely another attempt to relitigate our divorce. But Marcus hadn't waited. He'd somehow talked his way past security and appeared in our conference room, looking disheveled and desperate, in a way that immediately made everyone uncomfortable. "Natalie, I need to talk to you. It's important." "Marcus, I'm in a meeting. This is completely inappropriate." "I know, but I couldn't wait. I've been thinking about everything, and I realized something important." Rachel and our potential clients were staring at this unexpected drama unfolding in their business meeting. I could see them exchanging glances, clearly wondering if they should leave or call security. "Whatever you've realized can wait until after work," I said firmly. "You need to leave. Now." "I realize that I love you," Marcus announced as if this were breaking news, rather than something he should have figured out during our 8-year marriage. "I really love you, Natalie. I was just scared of how much I needed you." The silence in the conference room was deafening. Our potential clients looked mortified. Rachel looked furious, and I felt something I'd never experienced in relation to Marcus before: complete and utter embarrassment. "Marcus, you need to leave immediately, or I'm calling security." "But don't you understand? I love you. I don't want the divorce anymore." "I understand perfectly," I said, standing up and walking toward the door. "I understand that you've just realized that managing your own life is more difficult than you expected, and you want your personal assistant back. But I'm not available for that position anymore." I'd had to physically escort him out of the building while apologizing profusely to Rachel and our clients. The incident had been mortifying, but it had also crystallized something important for me. Marcus's declaration of love wasn't about love at all. It was about convenience, about control, about his discomfort with the consequences of his own choices. That evening, I'd called David Kim and asked him to expedite the divorce proceedings as much as possible. I'd also sent Marcus a certified letter, making it clear that any further attempts to contact me at work would result in a restraining order. The response had been swift and telling. Instead of apologizing for his inappropriate behavior or respecting my boundaries, Marcus had called David's office to complain that I was being unreasonable and vindictive. When David had calmly explained that showing up at someone's workplace to disrupt their business meetings could constitute harassment, Marcus had finally seemed to understand that his behavior was unacceptable. But even that realization hadn't stopped him from making one final attempt to derail the divorce. 2 days before our final court date, his attorney had called David with a surprising proposal. Marcus wanted to contest the divorce on grounds of reconciliation. "He's claiming that your acceptance of his divorce request was made under emotional duress," David had explained during an emergency phone call. "He says he never actually wanted a divorce, and that the whole thing was a misunderstanding." I'd laughed so hard that David had asked if I was okay. "Let me understand this correctly," I'd said when I could finally speak. "Marcus announced he wanted a divorce. I agreed. We've spent 6 weeks negotiating the terms, and now he wants to claim it was all a misunderstanding." That's essentially what he's arguing, yes. And his evidence for this misunderstanding is what exactly? Well, that's where his case falls apart. He can't explain why he would announce a divorce he didn't want, why he would consult an attorney beforehand, or why he would participate in 6 weeks of divorce proceedings if it was all just a communication error. What do you think will happen? I think the judge will laugh him out of court, frankly, but it might delay things by a few weeks while we respond to his motion. That's when I'd made a decision that surprised even me. "David, I want to represent myself at this hearing." "I'm sorry, what?" "I want to address the judge personally. I want to explain exactly what happened that night at the restaurant and exactly why Marcus's version of events is not just inaccurate but insulting." David had tried to talk me out of it, explaining that representing myself wasn't necessary and might complicate things unnecessarily. But I'd been insistent. After 8 years of letting Marcus control the narrative of our relationship, I wanted to tell my own story, in my own words, to someone who had the power to make it official. Which brought me to this moment, sitting in a Portland courtroom on a crisp December morning, watching Marcus and his attorney argue that my enthusiastic agreement to his divorce proposal was somehow evidence that I didn't actually want a divorce. Judge Patricia Williams looked as skeptical as I felt. She was a woman in her 60s with steel gray hair and the kind of no-nonsense demeanor that suggested she'd heard every ridiculous argument possible during her years on the bench. "Mr. Thompson," she said, looking over her reading glasses at Marcus's attorney, "let me make sure I understand your client's position." He announced to his wife that he wanted a divorce. She agreed. They spent 6 weeks negotiating the terms of that divorce, and now he's claiming that her agreement was somehow invalid because, why exactly? Marcus's attorney, a nervous-looking man named Robert Chen, shuffled through his papers uncertainly. "Your Honor, my client's position is that his announcement was intended to open a dialogue about their marital problems, not to actually initiate divorce proceedings." When Mrs. Rodriguez immediately agreed, she was acting emotionally rather than rationally. "I see, and Mr. Thompson's evidence for his wife's emotional instability at the time would be what?" "Well, Your Honor," she immediately became very enthusiastic about the divorce. She insisted on ordering dessert and celebrating. This suggests she wasn't thinking clearly. Judge Williams turned to look at me, and I could see the hint of a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Mrs. Rodriguez, would you like to respond to that characterization?" I stood up, smoothing down the navy blue dress I'd chosen specifically for this occasion. It was professional, confident, and completely different from anything I would have worn during my marriage. "Your Honor, I'd be happy to respond. But first I'd like to provide some context about the evening in question." "Please proceed." I took a deep breath and began to tell the story of that night at the Rooftop Terrace, but this time I told it as the protagonist of my own story, rather than as a supporting character in Marcus's drama. I described his calculated choice of setting, his obvious preparation for the conversation, his clear expectation that I would react with tears and pleading rather than agreement and enthusiasm. "Your Honor, my husband didn't make a mistake that night. He made a calculated decision to end our marriage in a way that would give him maximum control over my reaction. What he didn't anticipate was that I would respond as an autonomous adult rather than as a dependent who couldn't survive without him." Judge Williams was listening intently, occasionally glancing at Marcus, who was looking increasingly uncomfortable in his seat. "The reason I was enthusiastic about the divorce," I continued, "wasn't because I was emotionally unstable. It was because my husband had just offered me something I'd been wanting for months, but hadn't had the courage to pursue myself. He presented me with an escape from a marriage that had become emotionally exhausting and professionally limiting, and I was grateful for the opportunity." "And the dessert?" Judge Williams asked, and I could definitely see her trying not to smile now. "The dessert was excellent, Your Honor. When someone gives you exactly what you want, celebrating seems like the appropriate response." There was a moment of silence in the courtroom, and then Judge Williams turned back to Marcus's attorney. "Mr. Chen, does your client have any evidence that Mrs. Rodriguez was coerced, threatened, or otherwise unable to make rational decisions on the evening in question?" "No, Your Honor, but does your client have any evidence that Mrs. Rodriguez has been coerced, threatened, or otherwise unable to make rational decisions during the 6 weeks of divorce proceedings that followed?" "No, Your Honor, but my client believes." "What your client believes is irrelevant, Mr. Chen. What matters is what your client did." He announced he wanted a divorce, his wife agreed, and they have spent the subsequent weeks negotiating the terms of that divorce. The fact that Mr. Thompson now regrets his decision does not constitute grounds for invalidating his wife's consent to that decision. Judge Williams looked directly at Marcus for the first time. "Mr. Thompson, do you understand that marriage is a legal contract that requires the ongoing consent of both parties? You cannot unilaterally decide that your wife's withdrawal of consent from your marriage is invalid simply because you've changed your mind about wanting that consent withdrawn." Marcus stood up slowly, looking like a man who'd finally realized he was in a fight he couldn't win. "Your Honor, I love my wife. I made a mistake. I don't want to lose her." "Mr. Thompson, what you want is no longer the only consideration here. Your wife also has wants and needs, and she has clearly expressed her desire to end this marriage. The court cannot and will not force her to remain married to you against her will, regardless of your feelings on the matter." Judge Williams turned back to me. Mrs. Rodriguez, do you have anything else you'd like to add? I looked at Marcus one final time, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time in our entire relationship. He looked smaller somehow, diminished by his own inability to accept that his actions had consequences he couldn't control. Yes, Your Honor. I'd like to say that this divorce isn't happening because my husband made one mistake on one evening. It's happening because that evening revealed the fundamental dynamic of our entire marriage. For 8 years, I arranged my life around what my husband wanted and needed, often at the expense of what I wanted and needed. When he decided he no longer wanted to be married, I finally realized that what I wanted mattered too. And what I want is to be free to build a life where my choices and preferences have equal weight with my partner's. I can't do that in this marriage. Judge Williams nodded slowly. Motion to contest denied. This divorce is granted. As I walked out of the courthouse that afternoon, officially divorced and completely free for the first time in 8 years, I felt Marcus catch up with me on the steps. Natalie, wait. I turned around, no longer angry or hurt, just tired of the whole situation. What is it, Marcus? I'm sorry. I'm really truly sorry. I know I handled everything badly, but I never meant for it to go this far. I know you didn't, but that's exactly the problem. You never thought about what might happen if I took you seriously when you said you wanted out. You never considered that I might have my own feelings about our marriage. You just assumed I'd always be there, waiting for you to decide what our life should look like. I started walking down the courthouse steps, and Marcus walked beside me, still trying to find some way to undo what couldn't be undone. Is there any chance could we maybe try being friends? Start over somehow? I stopped walking and looked at him one final time. Marcus, we were never really friends. We were never even really partners. We were just two people who got very good at avoiding conflict by letting one person make all the decisions. I need to learn how to be in relationships where both people get to be fully themselves. I can't do that with you. As I walked away from Marcus for the last time, I felt something I'd never experienced before: complete ownership of my own life. The future stretched ahead of me, uncertain but entirely mine to shape. And for the first time in years, I couldn't wait to see what I would choose to do with it. 3 months after walking out of that courthouse, I was standing in the kitchen of my Alberta Arts District apartment, preparing dinner for a mate who knew my favorite type of coffee, remembered every story I told him about work, and had spent the previous evening helping me hang artwork in my living room, simply because he enjoyed seeing me create a space that reflected who I was. His name was Daniel Morrison, and I'd met him in the most unexpected way possible. He was a freelance photographer who'd been hired to document Sterling Marketing's tourism campaign, and our first conversation had lasted 3 hours without either of us noticing the time pass. He was nothing like Marcus physically. Where Marcus was tall and broad and commanding, Daniel was lean and thoughtful, with gentle hands that were always gesturing as he talked about light and composition and the stories he could capture through his camera. What struck me most about Daniel wasn't his appearance or even his talent, though both were considerable. It was the way he listened. When I told him about a challenging client or a campaign idea I was excited about, he asked follow-up questions that showed he'd actually absorbed what I was saying. When I mentioned offhandedly that I was recently divorced, he didn't immediately launch into advice or assumptions about what that meant. He simply nodded and waited to see if I wanted to share more. Our relationship had developed slowly, naturally, without any of the calculated maneuvering that had characterized my interactions with Marcus. Daniel never tried to impress me with grand gestures or expensive restaurants. Instead, he'd bring me coffee from Claire's Cafe when he knew I was working late, or send me photos he'd taken during his day because they reminded him of something I'd said. He was present in a way I'd forgotten was possible, engaged with my thoughts and feelings as if they were inherently interesting rather than potential obstacles to his own agenda. The contrast between my marriage and this relationship was so stark it was almost comical. Where Marcus had seen my professional success as a potential inconvenience, Daniel celebrated every achievement as if it were his own. When Sterling Marketing had won a prestigious industry award for the tourism campaign we'd collaborated on, Daniel had been more excited than I was, immediately suggesting we celebrate with champagne and a weekend trip to the coast. "You're brilliant at this," he'd said, reading the article about our win in Portland Business Journal. "I love watching you work. You have this incredible ability to see what people really want and find a way to give it to them authentically." The fact that he'd used the word authentically wasn't lost on me. Authenticity had become my guiding principle since the divorce, the lens through which I evaluated every decision and relationship. I'd spent 8 years being whoever Marcus needed me to be in any given moment. Now I was determined to simply be myself and see who was drawn to that person. Daniel apparently was very drawn to that person. He loved my tendency to rearrange furniture when I was thinking through a problem. He found my extensive collection of vintage books charming rather than cluttered. He encouraged my growing interest in photography, even giving me one of his older cameras and spending patient hours teaching me about aperture and shutter speed. Most importantly, he never tried to manage my emotions or control my reactions. When I told him about Marcus's final desperate attempt to contest the divorce, Daniel had listened to the entire story, without once suggesting how I should feel about it, or what I should do next. He'd simply said, "That must have been frustrating," and then asked if I wanted to talk about it more, or if I'd prefer to focus on something else. This kind of emotional autonomy was so foreign to me that it had taken weeks to stop waiting for the other shoe to drop, for Daniel to reveal that his respect for my independence was conditional or temporary. But as months passed, he continued to treat me as a fully autonomous adult, whose thoughts and feelings were valid without requiring his approval or modification. The divorce had been finalized just as winter settled into Portland, and I'd spent the holidays entirely on my own terms for the first time in nearly a decade. Instead of the elaborate family gatherings Marcus had preferred, I'd hosted a small dinner party in my apartment for Claire, Daniel, and a few colleagues from work. We'd cooked together, played board games, and stayed up until 2 in the morning talking about everything and nothing. It was exactly the kind of evening I'd always wanted but had never been able to create in my marriage. Marcus, I'd heard through mutual acquaintances, had not adapted as well to single life. According to Tyler Walsh, whom I'd run into at a coffee shop downtown, Marcus had thrown himself into work with an obsessive intensity that was concerning even his business partner. He'd apparently gone on a series of dates that had all ended badly, usually because he'd spent most of the evening talking about his divorce and how he'd been misunderstood by his ex-wife. "He keeps saying you changed," Tyler had told me with obvious discomfort. "Like you became a different person out of nowhere." I told him maybe you didn't change. Maybe you just stopped pretending to be someone you weren't. He didn't like that very much. I'd felt a brief flash of sadness for Marcus, not because I regretted my decision, but because he seemed genuinely unable to understand that other people existed as fully realized individuals, rather than supporting characters in his personal narrative. The Marcus I'd been married to would have been perfectly happy with a wife who remained static and accommodating forever. The idea that I might grow and change and develop my own opinions had apparently never occurred to him as a possibility. But that sadness was brief and quickly replaced by gratitude for the life I was building. My apartment had become a space that truly reflected who I was, colorful and eclectic, filled with books and art and plants that I'd chosen simply because they made me happy. My career was flourishing in ways I'd never imagined possible when I was constantly worried about how my success might affect Marcus's mood. Most importantly, I was discovering parts of myself that had been dormant for years. I'd started taking pottery classes on Tuesday evenings, something I'd always wanted to try but had never pursued, because Marcus thought it was messy and impractical. I'd joined a hiking group that met every other weekend, exploring trails around Portland that I'd driven past for years without stopping. I'd even started learning Spanish through an online program, motivated by nothing more than my own curiosity about language and culture. Each of these activities was small in itself, but together they represented something revolutionary, a life lived according to my own interests and desires, rather than someone else's approval or convenience. I was rediscovering what it felt like to want things for myself, and then pursue them without having to justify or negotiate those desires with anyone else. Claire had been amazed by the transformation. "You're like a completely different person," she'd said, during one of our regular coffee dates. "Not different in a bad way, just more yourself, if that makes sense." It made perfect sense to me. I was more myself than I'd been in years, possibly more myself than I'd ever been. The woman who'd agreed to marry Marcus at 24 had been young and eager to please, willing to reshape herself to fit someone else's vision of what a good partner should be. The woman I was now at 32 knew her own mind, and wasn't afraid to express it. Daniel had been particularly supportive of this journey of self-discovery. When I'd mentioned wanting to travel more, he'd immediately suggested we plan a photography trip together to document the Oregon coast. When I'd expressed interest in taking some business classes to expand my marketing skills, he'd helped me research programs and offered to adjust his own schedule to accommodate mine. "I love that you're always growing," he'd told me one evening as we walked through the Pearl District after dinner. I love that you have so many interests and opinions. It makes every conversation feel like an adventure. The contrast with my marriage couldn't have been starker. Marcus had wanted a wife who remained consistent and predictable, who could be counted on to react the same way to the same situations indefinitely. Daniel seemed to find my evolution fascinating and inspiring rather than threatening or inconvenient. 6 months after my divorce was finalized, I received an unexpected email from Marcus. It was brief and formal, almost businesslike in tone. He wanted to apologize for his behavior during the divorce proceedings and to wish me well in my new life. He'd attached a single photo, a picture of the front porch of our old house, which he'd finally restored to its original condition. I thought you might want to see this, the email read. I finally got around to fixing the porch like I always promised I would. I guess some promises are easier to keep after the fact. I hope you're happy, Natalie. You deserve to be happy. I'd stared at that photo for a long time, feeling a complex mix of emotions I couldn't quite untangle. The porch looked beautiful, exactly as I'd imagined it might look when we'd first bought the house together 8 years earlier. But seeing it completed now felt like looking at an artifact from someone else's life, a reminder of dreams that had belonged to a different version of myself. I'd shown the email to Daniel, unsure how he might react to communication from my ex-husband, but his response had been characteristically thoughtful and supportive. "How do you feel about it?" he'd asked, studying the photo with genuine interest. "Sad, I think. But not the kind of sad that makes me want to go back. More like the kind of sad you feel when you realize how much time you spent waiting for someone to become the person you needed them to be." Daniel had nodded, understanding immediately what I meant. "Do you think you'll respond?" "I don't think so. I think some chapters are meant to end completely." I deleted the email without replying, not out of anger or resentment, but simply because I had nothing left to say to Marcus. The life we'd shared felt like something that had happened to someone else, and the woman I was now had her own story to write. That story was turning out to be more interesting and fulfilling than anything I'd imagined during my marriage. Sterling Marketing had promoted me to creative director, a position that came with increased responsibility, a significant salary bump, and the autonomy to shape campaigns according to my own vision. I'd started speaking at industry conferences, sharing insights about authentic marketing strategies that had grown directly from my own journey toward authenticity. Daniel and I had been talking about moving in together, a conversation that was completely different from any relationship discussion I'd had with Marcus. Instead of one person making decisions and the other accommodating them, we talked through every aspect of what shared living might look like. We discussed how to maintain our individual identities while building something together, how to support each other's careers without sacrificing our own goals, how to create a space that reflected both of our personalities. "I want to make sure we're choosing each other every day," Daniel had said during one of these conversations, "not just defaulting to being together because it's comfortable or convenient." This idea of actively choosing each other, of treating our relationship as something that required ongoing mutual consent rather than a binding contract that eliminated other options, felt revolutionary to me. It was the complete opposite of my marriage, where I'd often felt trapped by obligations and expectations, rather than empowered by mutual desire and respect. As I stood in my kitchen that evening, preparing dinner for someone who saw me as a partner rather than a service provider, I thought about how dramatically my life had changed since that rainy October night at the Rooftop Terrace. Marcus's announcement that he wanted a divorce had felt like the end of the world at the time, but it had actually been the beginning of everything I'd never known I wanted. The woman who'd walked out of that restaurant in her soaked emerald dress had been someone I barely recognized now, someone who'd made herself so small and accommodating that she'd almost disappeared entirely. The woman I was now took up space unapologetically, expressed opinions confidently, and pursued her own happiness, as if it were not only acceptable but essential. My phone buzzed with a text from Claire asking if I wanted to meet for brunch the next morning to celebrate her cafe's expansion into a second location. I immediately texted back yes, already excited to hear about her plans and offer whatever support I could. This was what friendship looked like when both people were allowed to be fully themselves, mutual celebration of each other's successes, rather than careful management of jealousy or competition. Daniel emerged from the living room where he'd been editing photos from our recent trip to the Columbia River Gorge. He wrapped his arms around me from behind and kissed the top of my head, a gesture that was affectionate without being possessive. "Something smells amazing. What are we having?" "Risotto with wild mushrooms. And I opened that bottle of wine you brought back from Willamette Valley." "Perfect. Should I set the table?" These kinds of small collaborative moments had become the foundation of my happiness. Not grand gestures or expensive gifts, but the daily reality of sharing space with someone who treated me as an equal partner in creating our shared life. As we sat down to dinner, Daniel told me about a gallery owner who'd expressed interest in showing some of his work, and I shared news about a potential client who wanted to hire sterling marketing for a major campaign. We talked about our respective successes with genuine enthusiasm for each other's achievements, neither of us feeling threatened by the other's professional growth. This was what love looked like when both people were allowed to be complete individuals, not the careful choreography of accommodation and resentment that had characterized my marriage, but a dynamic partnership between two people who chose to build something together while maintaining their own identities. Later that evening, as Daniel and I cleaned up the kitchen together, I caught my reflection in the window and barely recognized the confident, relaxed woman looking back at me. She was someone who knew what she wanted, and wasn't afraid to pursue it, someone who took up exactly as much space as she needed, someone who had learned that happiness wasn't something you waited for someone else to give you, it was something you created for yourself. That night, as I fell asleep in my own apartment, in my own bed, surrounded by books and art and plants that I'd chosen because they made me happy, I felt a deep sense of gratitude for the worst thing that had ever happened to me. Marcus's decision to announce our divorce over anniversary dinner had been cruel and manipulative, but it had also been the catalyst for everything good that had followed. Sometimes the best thing that can happen to you is someone else making the difficult decision you've been too afraid to make for yourself. Sometimes the end of everything you thought you wanted is actually the beginning of everything you never knew you needed. And sometimes when someone shows you exactly who they are, the kindest thing you can do for both of you is believe them, and then build a life that honors who you really are instead. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.